Welcome back to another episode of The Album Years with myself, Stephen Wilson, and Tim Bowness. Tim, say hello.
Yeah.
Now, Tim, I've got a bone to pick with you straight away. Off air, you've just admitted to me that in the early days of The Album Years, you used to edit it to make it sound like I was constantly interrupting you and dominating the conversation.
Well, what it was actually the first couple of episodes where you were constantly interrupting me.
I was not.
And so I
was not constantly...
I deliberately cut your voice in a second or two earlier to make you sound even ruder. And what, in fact, was a delight for me was when at least one person did say, Stephen, just let Tim speak a little bit. You're really rude, actually. So I succeeded.
Yeah, but you also said you used to cut out most of what you'd said to make it sound like I was the only one dominating the conversation.
I did cut out very long monologues, yeah. So, in fact, it did sound like you were the one with verbal diarrhea and I was concise.
Okay, on a serious note, guys, welcome back. We promised last time, didn't we, Tim, that we would do a year from the current millennium. So
we did, foolishly.
Well, we haven't gone against our promise, have we?
We nearly did. In fact, when I presented it to you, I think we had about 3 or 4... emails where we were almost contemplating just hoping that no one had heard it.
Well, I thought you were going to say that we had 3 or 4 albums from the entire 21st century.
Well, we had 3 or 4 albums from
us.
the entire 21st century that we liked. That was it. That was problem number 1. And then obviously problem number 2, how do you fill an episode with those 3 or 4 albums spaced over 24 years?
So we've just about scraped in, haven't we? We're doing 2000, folks. Technically, is that part of the current millennium or is that part of the previous? I'm never quite sure the rules.
I think technically they say it isn't, but for our purposes it certainly is.
That's the best you're going to get from us anyway, guys. Now, this could be a short episode, having said that even then, because I've got to say, Tim, I've probably got about, of the albums on this on the list, I've probably got about 10% and I've maybe heard, at least until I did the research for this episode, because I have listened to some of these albums subsequently. But probably until then, I'd probably only heard about 20% of the albums on this list. What about you?
Well, I think for me, I've probably kept about 5% on the list, but I've probably owned or listened to 40, 50, 60%.
Really? Okay, so you know a lot. You know a lot of these records. At least you've heard a lot of these records.
Well, yeah, something that we should discuss at some point. Is there a cut-off point of where our enthusiasm is for contemporary music? But for me, looking at this list, I'm still really excited. I think that, we're entering the new century and there's a lot of very fresh, very interesting music. I don't think the album years are dead at this stage.
Okay, I mean, I would agree with you. I think there are some tremendous records on this list, but there's also the beginnings of what I can see is going to ultimately turn me away from exploring and being curious about a lot of contemporary music as well, and I'm sure we'll come on to that.
Yeah.
Let's start off with the elephant in the room, the album that kind of casts a shadow over the whole year. This is the album that was almost unanimously voted the best album of the year by all the tastemakers. It's a band that emerged in the 90s and have gone on to become arguably, the equivalent to what the progressive rock bands of the 70s were, a band that constantly reinvent themselves and have managed to appeal, I guess, across a very wide demographic. And we're talking, of course, about Radiohead here. And this was a watershed year for Radiohead because this was the kind of moment that we all realised, when I say we all, myself and Tim, we kind of realised that Radiohead were going to be more than just, quote unquote, the new U2.
Sure.
They were going to shake things up. Now, it's interesting because you've put this in the category of electronica, but this album is much more than electronica, isn't it? I mean, it's got everything. It's got jazz, it's got krautrock, it's got avant-garde classical music, it's got ambient pieces. And there's still a lot of guitars on it too, isn't there? So it's not like they've completely abandoned their sort of guitar sound. But there is something about it overall that feels like a complete reinvention. The fact they released no singles from the album. The fact that it feels almost like a complete rejection of everything that Britpop had kind of stood for over the previous, the heyday of Britpop was probably the mid-90s through to this point. And suddenly Radiohead are like saying, okay, that's over, and this is like a moment where possibilities open up for guitar bands, I guess, doesn't it?
Well, I think, there's so many interesting things about this album. One of them, for me, is that I think that OK Computer which I do think is a great album, I thought was overrated in the sense that a lot of people said this is the first rock album of the 21st century. And for me, I heard a lot of experimental 80s guitar music in OK Computer. I mean, I loved the bends. And I felt OK Computer was, a relatively logical, relatively safe follow-up. And suddenly on this album, Kid A, and then Amnesiac that follows it, they genuinely are a rock band for the 21st century. It's almost like Kid A is what people said OK Computer was for me. So I like OK Computer, think it's a great album, love some of the music, but it was never to me that revolutionary statement as I could hear anything from Crimson to U2 to Cocteau Twins to Dylan to John Lennon. There were all sorts of 20th century reference points in that album.
Yeah, and also OK Computer is still kind of allied to the idea of the conventional pop
rock band
song structure,
exactly,
isn't it?
Yeah.
And suddenly on Kid A, we don't care about structure. We
Anything
don't care about
goes.
those pop song structures anymore.
And
Anything
the U2
goes.
thing you're saying is interesting because I think U2 obviously tried this trick in the sense that, in the early 90s, they decided to completely reject what people perceived as their pompous, anthemic rock music. But when you listen to that, when you listen to Acting Baby, which is a really strong album, I think, it's a bit like U2 with a Frankenstein mask on. Actually, the body of it hasn't changed very much. Whereas you listen to Kid A, and they really have shifted shape. U2 were always U2 on pop, on Acting Baby. It was the Unforgettable Fire band ever so slightly transformed, as I said, almost with a mask on. Whereas with Kid A, this is absolutely revolutionising the idea of what a rock band can be in the 21st century. And you feel that when they're entering electronica or ambient, these are 100% immersions into it.
And isn't that the magic trick that Radiohead have managed to pull off? And now, Tom and Johnny are working as a Smile, essentially an extension. It feels like an extension of Radiohead to me. Isn't that the magic trick that they've pulled off, really, which is to be able to make this, what is ultimately very experimental music, but almost like in a kind of Trojan horse way, sneak it under the noses of people that don't listen to experimental electronic music or experimental classical music.
Yeah.
I've just been listening to the new Smile album, which I really love, but there's some, it's funny. It's a funny thing with Tom and Johnny. I always feel like I can hear what they've been listening to. Do you know what I mean? But that's not to say that they're kind of like, they're not pastiching that music. They definitely make it their own, and they definitely filter it through their own personality. But I feel like I can always hear, they've been listening to this. They've been listening to Penderecki, or they've been listening to Ortega, or they've been listening to Alice
Walker,
or
like
Scott
on this
Walker. Yeah,
album, the Scott Walker chord. Is it running through How to Disappear? I'm not quite sure, but
it's been a while since I listened to it. To be fair, it's one of the albums I didn't go back and listen to again for this because I felt like I knew it well enough already. But there's definitely a sense that you can kind of hear Magpie-like what they've kind of been borrowing from. There's the one track which is very krautrock influenced, very obviously krautrock influenced, but it doesn't sound like Can or Faust or Neu. It sounds like Radiohead, but you can hear, they've been listening to that. And I think that isn't just coming back to my original point, isn't that in a sense the magic trick that they've managed to pull off because they've been a band coming off the back of OK Computer, which sold 10 million copies or whatever. They've been able, a bit like the Beatles were with Revolution 9 on the White Album, in introducing musique concrète to people that never knew they liked or were interested in musique concrète. Radiohead have done a similar thing with very esoteric electronic music, avant-garde classical music, avant-garde jazz music. But somehow they always make it have this kind of luminous, strange beauty, don't they? Whatever they take, these sort of so-called ugly sounds and these atonal sounds, they somehow manage to make them sound beautiful.
National Anthem has that free jazz explosion, the groove, then the free jazz. Yeah. And you're right, they're taking avant-garde ideas into the mainstream. And it's one of those things that, it's one of the few things that I'm kind of really envious of, that, there's no compromise on this. And yet it was number one globally, whereas actually, so I say, go back to one of our previous editions, 1977, and we were talking about Rumours. And when Tusk came out, which was vaguely experimental compared to this, Fleetwood Mac suffered. They suffered sales-wise. Pink Floyd suffered on the final cut from The Wall. Kid A takes the experimental template even further, and it pays dividends. They're number one globally. They managed to get away with it.
Well, to be fair, The Final Cut and Tusk were also number one albums. I think you're talking more about the critical, not necessarily the critical reaction, but the public's reaction. Now, to be fair, I'm looking at the Wikipedia page for Kid A. At the time, apparently, according to this, it had very mixed reviews and a very mixed response.
Right.
But I think its stature, because it was a shock. It was a shock. I remember speaking to a very good friend of mine who'd been massively, massively into OK Computer, almost to the point of obsession. And I said to him, "Oh, have you bought Kid A?" He said, "Yeah, it sounds like a lot of B-sides." And there had been a sense that Radiohead had been hinting at what they were going to do on Kid A on the B-sides for OK Computer. I don't know if you're familiar with some of those B-sides.
Yeah.
And they're great. And suddenly Kid A is a whole album of these quote-unquote B-sides, and he didn't get it at all. But I think its stature has grown and grown because it's now seen as, I mean, you kind of alluded to this in a way, in your kind of intro about the album. It's seen as the first album that indicates where rock music can go in the 21st century. And part of me is slightly disappointed that it hasn't been more of an influence on rock music in the 21st century.
Well, I think one of the reasons how it worked is that Amnesiac reinforced it, came relatively quickly afterwards. Arguably was a slightly better album.
Yeah,
I was going to say, personally, I prefer it. And I think it reinforced all of the positive elements of Kid A and, of course, Soul just as well. So, it wasn't a one-off. This was a serious change. And what, of course, is fascinating, because I remember, late 90s, as you say, not only fans, but bands were kind of obsessed with OK Computer. I remember having to be a part of a kind of a battle of the bands, a judge in Norwich. All of the new bands were sounding like they'd come out of the Bends or they'd come out of OK Computer, just at the point when Radiohead absolutely shifted gear and became something else. And of course, what we're going to see and maybe talk about later is a few of the bands who really do make a mark on 2000. Coldplay. They've listened to Radiohead.
Yeah.
Muse, who are about to become massive. Obviously, another sort of Radiohead derivative. But Radiohead themselves aren't listening to Radiohead. They're just steaming
So
forward.
maybe let's jump a little bit ahead to that, because I've got a category here called the Britpop Fallout. And in this category, I have put some of the albums that you could argue were closer to the sort of OK Computer Bends blueprint. So you mentioned Coldplay there, now Parachutes, which I think is a brilliant record, one of the great debut records, but there's almost a sense, isn't there, that this was the album for the disenchanted Radiohead fan.
Exactly that. Yeah, well, it is. It's the most accessible elements of the Bends and OK Computer with a very, very pretty production sheen. And I think, Chris Martin has probably got a more accessible voice as well than Tom York. But they're great songs. The point is, it's beautifully produced. They're great songs. And there's a real confidence about that album as well for a debut.
But it probably wouldn't have got signed if it hadn't been for the success of Radiohead. And so in this category, Britpop Fallout, I've also got Oasis released an album. The kind of spell of Oasis has kind of worn off, hasn't it, by this point? I think it's fair to say the previous record, Be Here Now, had damaged their critical and commercial standing, probably to the point of never been able to come back from it, really. Standing on the Shoulder of Giants. I mean, I bought the first couple of Oasis records and I quite enjoyed them. I know you weren't such a fan. Great melodicist Noel Gallagher, great traditional songwriter. I'd stopped listening by this point. I never heard this record. I still haven't heard this record.
See, I have.
Okay, you have. Go on then. For the podcast.
Weirdly enough, I don't mind it.
No,
I
I'm sure.
I was aware of it at the time.
Okay.
I mean, once more, Oasis were never, ever going to be my favourite band, but I think they did what they did with real skill and detail. There are some great songs, great melodies, and they're both strong vocalists, actually. This is something that I feel is missing from, say, Doves that we're going to discuss and Stone Roses. The thing is that Oasis had a great front person with a really strong quality of voice. So though they're never necessarily going to be my favourite band, I've always got respect for them. And this album actually I kind of like because it's them slightly going off the rails. There's a lot of Beatles psychedelia in it. There's maybe even a lot of OK Computer kind of psychedelic workouts.
So that's
as well.
kind of what I was getting at here. I think it's, again, you kind of mentioned this in a way that a lot of bands were listening to Radiohead, except Radiohead had already moved on. And Radiohead, in a sense, were redefining what rock music would be 2, 3, 4 years later, while bands like Oasis had just discovered OK Computer, and Parachutes, Coldplay definitely seems like something born out of that kind of approach. Let's talk about the Doves albums, Lost Souls. I didn't know this record. I listened to it. I thought it was really good, I've got to say. The worst thing I can say about it, and this is, again, what you just alluded to a minute ago, is the vocals are a little bit nondescript. And perhaps that was the reason why, because they didn't have a Chris Martin or a Liam Gallagher, that's why it's not a better known record. But it seems like a very, very creative, extension of, again, the sort of post Radiohead climate. It's definitely got that kind of stadium filling rock sound to it, but there's some very interesting things going on in the production. There are clever things going on in the production, sonically clever things. There are clever things going on in the time signatures. It seems like it's also harking back a little bit to post-punk in a way too. And I was quite impressed, although I can see that for you, the vocals would probably be the problem.
I think they're good. I mean, actually, I've always quite liked Doves. I think there is this kind of atmospheric goth quality, and there's almost a kind of progressive ambition in the music. And I think they come from a dance music background. They come from sort of Manchester dance music background and then became a rock band. So it's an interesting birth.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, musically, I like them quite a lot, and I don't dislike it vocally. I think vocally it's absolutely fine,
right?
But it's not one of those voices that you're not going to fall
in love
with or hate.
Yeah.
So that's the thing.
It's neutral.
There are some great melodies and some great guitar playing. So I think "Sea Song" is one of the pieces on this, isn't it?
Yes, I love that one.
Which I think is really powerful.
That was the one in
piece of
6/8,
music.
isn't it?
Yeah. So there's some music on this that I think is tremendously strong. I suppose it's that thing where, for me, there's sort of 70-80% there, and it doesn't quite burn with the ferocity of a My Bloody Valentine or what have you, when you maybe want it to. But it's really good. I mean, it's...
Yeah, I was impressed. I mean, as someone myself that has a very meh, sort of neutral voice, I understand the issues sometimes. Not everyone can be Jeff Buckley or Chris Martin or Tom York or whatever. We have to deal with what we're given by Mother Nature and all that stuff. But I was impressed by this record. It's something I missed at the time. I can see why it's regarded as a little bit of a sort of a lost classic of the period.
Well, you like what follows as well, I think.
Okay.
There's a couple more albums that kind of develop this even further. And I think we were talking about the time signature and even progressive reference. Weirdly, I think it's the next album, they do a kind of a cover of King Crimson's Moonchild. So
also in the Britpop fallout, I've got Placebo's Black Market Music and Blackbox Recorder, The Facts of Life, which has just been given a new lease of life by Billie Eilish, no less than Billie Eilish.
Oh, really?
Who apparently did an Instagram clip where she was listening to is it the title track, the one that goes that life sucks, get over it, kill yourself and get over it? Is that the fact?
I don't know, to be honest.
Apparently it went from like 1 million streams on Spotify to something like 20 billion overnight or something, because Billie Eilish had been
Have you
filming
got
herself
contact for her?
Afraid not. No. Anyway, but let's go back to, so Radiohead nominally you'd kind of put in the electronic section.
Yeah, though I think listening to it again, you could, I do think it's a massive reinvention. But there are tracks like Optimism where actually they are still, in effect, a U2 template rock band. A rock band with interesting textures and that tribal rhythm. So there were maybe more echoes of what Radiohead were before than I remembered.
You remember? Yeah, I think that's the thing, because a lot of people talk about this as the moment Radiohead go electronic.
Yeah.
I think what they mean by that is this is the moment Radiohead start to display their influences from listening to electronic music. So I can hear they've listened to Autechre, and I can hear they've listened to, Boards of Canada or whatever. But actually, they've absorbed it into their vocabulary as a rock band. An album like King of Limbs, for example, 10 years later, is much more electronic than this record. This record seems more transitional than perhaps it did at the time. I think it was such a shock to hear it at the time based on what had gone before.
And given they're a great band, it's like it's got a great rhythm section. That rhythm section maybe only play on about half of it.
Right.
So I think it is different in that sense. Every other album they've done previously, they are a band almost. Even those B-sides you're talking about from OK Computer, it's a band filtered through effects units and sounding quite alien. It's still a band.
Yeah.
This time round, there were pure electronica pieces.
There certainly were, the title track for one. Yeah. So let's go back to the electronic section and just talk a little bit more about some of the other electronic music from this year. Now, Blue Jam by Chris Morris, another one that's sort of only nominally electronic, quote unquote. This is Chris Morris is a comedian, a very, very satirical comedian whose influence on British comedy is widely felt, I think, as a kind of very satirical sort of guy. And this, I almost describe this is an album of some of the sketches from his show Blue Jam, where the music is a very important part of the sort of effect, isn't it? It kind of all adds to this slightly surreal, absurdist quality that the comedy has. And I kind of call this ambient comedy because there's this very queasy electronic ambient music, very often which he's taking from the Warp artists.
Yeah.
So he's using tracks from Aphex Twin, Selected Ambient Works 2, for example, to kind of add to this sense of unease you feel when you're listening to these sketches, which are, I mean, I say they're comedy, but I mean, they're the blackest comedy you could possibly imagine. But would it be fair to say that he's doing something very new here in the way that he's using music?
It's difficult to say. I mean, it sustains a really kind of woozy and, as you said, queasy atmosphere. And I kind of almost find it, and not in a bad way, it's almost sleep-inducing because you're lost in that world of sound. And it's only when you start to concentrate on the language that you realise how strange and how uncomfortable it can make you feel on occasion, really. And I think, the music does a good job of that. Yeah, it's a fantastically curated ambient collection in that it suits the narrative so well. And as you said, on one level, it's kind of quite seductive, quite woozy, quite sleep-inducing, but on another level, it kind of almost makes you want to vomit.
I mean, it's extremely confrontational comedy, and some of it you would barely say is comedy at all. It's just absurd. Yeah. And it's almost like, in some ways, it's a very British thing because it's all about dismantling this idea of social graces and political correctness. And I think he was one of the first comedian or comic writers. I mean, to be fair, Chris Morris himself doesn't appear in a lot of Blue Jam. It's other people like is it Julia Davis and Mark Heap.
Yeah.
And he's one of the first comic writers that almost does that thing where you can't say that. You can't say that, but he does. He goes ahead and you kind of laugh despite yourself.
Yeah. Well, it followed Brass Eye, wasn't it? It's his first project after Brass Eye, I think.
I think it might have been, yeah. But then there was the Day-to-Day before that, which was the kind of satirical news show. And he says things that you kind of, you laugh at and you find yourself thinking to yourself, I shouldn't be laughing at that. Yeah. Which is why I think he's been so influential on a generation of comedians since, like Ricky Gervais or like Jimmy Carr.
Yeah.
That say these things that you find yourself laughing at and then realise they're so unpolitically correct. But I think, to be fair, no disrespect to Chris Morris and Ricky Gervais, I think Chris Morris did it on another level of smartness and intellect. I mean, he is really dismantling, polite society through a lot of. But you're right. I think there's something about the comedy that is a very musical experience. The way he's using sound design, music to put you in this kind of surreal, absurdist frame of mind where you can connect with things that are on the page barely comedy at all. They're actually really offensive.
Well, I think he wanted it on, originally 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. because he wanted people to listen to it
be drunk
in a particular state. Almost, either drunk or drunk with sleep in some way, so that it's even more surreal. And eventually I think they played them at midnight. That was the compromise that they came to.
Yeah.
But I think he was conscious of how he wanted people to absorb this as well, which I quite like, because he's curating the music, curating the text, and then also he wants to curate how we respond to it.
But he's also, we're getting into this, dismantling the whole idea of comedy here now, but it's also brilliant is that this kind of mixture of highbrow and lowbrow in his comedy, isn't it? So you do get this sketch where a man walks into a doctor's surgery and it feels very uncomfortable and very absurdist, and then they end up basically having a competition to see who can make their willy flap the highest. So it goes from being very highbrow and very intellectual to being, you know, smutty and lowbrow. But all the way through there's this very uncomfortable electronic, queasy electronic music.
Well, it's as confrontational as Derek and Clive, but whereas Derek and Clive, he slaps you in the face straight away.
Yeah.
This is kind of almost like stealth bombing you.
You're not sure how to feel about it, are you?
Yeah.
You're not sure how to... And I think that's the thing about that sort of brand of comedy. You're not sure whether you should be laughing, crying, or just with your jaw on the floor.
Yeah.
I mean, the one sketch I can never forget from Blue Jam is the parents that have their child has been kidnapped, and they're like just talk. Oh, by the way, love, did you pick up Jimmy from the school today? No. Has he not come home then? No, little bugger. And it goes on like this, and for days afterwards, and then finally they find him murdered in a wood. Oh, by the way, love, I had a phone call about little Jimmy. Yeah, they found him murdered in the woods. Yeah, apparently it was our neighbour, the fucker. I'm going to go and have a word with him later.
Didn't he also do the TV version of this as well?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, so that was just called Jam.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which was equally unnerving.
Well, even more so in that sense. Yeah.
And again, I think the visuals in that went with this score, if you remember.
Yeah, I love it. Chris Morris is a modern comedy genius, I think. Anyway, so we've kind of digress slightly there to talking about comedy, but it's very hard to talk about this record. You have to kind of hear it to understand what we're talking about.
Well, it's important for because I think as well, sometimes comedy kind of intersects with music. You know, you think of, say, Monty Python were very popular with underground artists of the 60s, 70s, and it went both ways. You know, they loved Python loved that music. Yeah. And you could see it as well, I think, when Baddiel and Newman were really entwined with the whole Britpop culture as well.
Stuart Lee
and Lee and Herring.
Yeah, Stuart Lee's interesting music.
And I think that this was really as important to UK electronica as the Aphex Twin in its own way.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because there's a lot of Aphex Twin in Chris Morris. I found the whole thing, the whole idea of deconstructing the idea of having a public face to music, the way that Aphex Twin would always make his covers look as ugly as possible. You know, a portrait of him, but as ugly as can be. Yeah. And there's a sense of that going on in Chris Morris's work too. Let's move on. A few other records. Now, Tim, I've got used to this. When I talk about electronic music, I'm really passionate about the 90s particularly, which for me is the golden age of modern electronica. Bands like Autechre and Aphex we've talked about. This is one of my favourites from the 90s. And I get used to saying to you, oh, you got to listen to this, Tim. It's one of my favourite electronic bands from the 90s. And you go, I listened to it. It was all right. So this is another one. Gas. Wolfgang Voigt released his album Pop, his fourth album this year. Yeah. This is one of the most special electronic acts of all time for me. You listened to it, Tim. What did you think about it?
I couldn't believe it. My mind was blown, man.
Don't lie to me. Don't lie to me. You thought it was all right.
I thought it was quite pretty, yeah. Quite liked it. No, I did. I listened to the album in its entirety. Right. Genuinely enjoyed it. Lovely, amorphous textures, quite sweet half melodies with the loops.
So his whole thing, Wolfgang Voigt's thing with Gas, is he takes loops from classical records.
Okay.
And he basically he rusts them. Right. He makes them sound like they've been left out in the rain for about 10 years. Okay. So we've talked about this before, the kind of hauntological thing about how things sound like they're beaming in, and they sound old, they sound decayed.
Well, this sounded like it was recorded in a forest.
Exactly. That's his thing. Right. So all of the artwork also is these close-up, very kind of micro images of like leaves and bushes and things. So yes, you're absolutely right. It's a wonderful atmosphere. It's a one gag act. All his records sound like that, but it's a gag I could listen to forever. It's just I
liked it.
So powerful. You liked it? Well, that's more than I expected. I thought you were going to say, it's all right. What about Boards of Canada's In a Beautiful... Have we talked about Boards of Canada on the show?
Very briefly.
We must have referred to them.
But this one, I liked the first and the third piece quite a lot. Weird. I genuinely liked it. I thought it was, very beautiful, very hypnotic. Again, gorgeous textures. I think a bit like the Gas album, what I quite like is it had quite distressed textures, which appealed to me.
Yeah.
The beats seemed weirdly old-fashioned to me. That it seemed like the sort of things that you and I were doing in the late 80s, actually. Didn't mind it, but the textures I loved, and I really liked the use of the voice from the religious commune. The whole title of the EP comes from the Waco community, doesn't it? This idea of... And of course, like you, I've always had a fascination for religious cults. So anything to do with Waco or Scientology, I'm on board. So I liked it.
And that's also the thing with Boards of Canada. Whenever they do use voices, it's in this very kind of impressionistic, haunted way. So like the title track, as you say, the voice... when you actually hear the main vocal line, it's spoken through a vocoder, so there's this kind of sense of distance. But it's very beautiful, very affecting, very emotional. You're right, the rhythms are nothing. They're certainly not in the sort of league of Square Push or Aphex Twin or Tekka. They don't have anywhere near that degree of complexity, which I think actually is why Boards of Canada became much more successful. They were very... certainly their first couple of records kind of crossed over, I think.
Yeah.
It's quite a broad audience and sold probably better than Warp Records usually.
You're not going to choke your chicken out at the dinner party with this.
They're very pretty. They're very beautiful superficially. But the more you go in, there is this sense of unease. There is this sense of something a little bit more uncomfortable below the surface.
Well, there's a great sense. What I thought about it was, it's my thing that when I listen to music like this, which I really genuinely liked, I'm hearing vocal melodies, I'm hearing lyrics. Immediately it evokes something in me.
Right.
Which is a good thing,
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Now, the folks listening at home won't realise this, but just then we took a break, Tim, didn't we?
We did.
It's been edited out now, but we took a break then. And just while we took the break there, Rob Scarin, who is sitting there listening, said he listened to the Gas and he really liked it. It sounds like there's a rave going on in the distance. And I think that's a really good way to describe Gas. So I'm going to appropriate that. When anyone asks me about Gas, I'm going to say, it sounds like there's a rave going on the other side of a forest, because that's kind of what
So you're going to take
like.
my forest comment and his rave comment and credit them both to you?
That's what I've been doing my whole career.
Okay.
So my whole career. I'm not going to stop now.
Yep.
One more album to talk about in the electronica section. Broadcast, The Noise Made by People. The debut album by Broadcast. Now, Broadcast are an interesting band because they were kind of in love with like things like the BBC Radiophonic Workshop and library music. And there's been a whole... I don't know what's an explosion of that, but there has been a little genre that's kind of grown up around that. Labels like Ghostbox, Stereolab were always into that too. Well, how do you feel about that kind of approach, Tim? Is it sort of...
I like it. I mean, again, this album I thought was, it's a very sweet album. But what it kind of reminded me of as much as anything else is, a lot of people at the time were kind of comparing it to things like Portishead, bizarrely. But I sort of hear it as being more Jane and Barton. More Saint Etienne. It's got that kind of early 80s quality. That's why I say Jane and Barton. That kind of very naive early 80s.
It's deliberately... This sounds like a negative...
Young Marble Giants.
This sounds like a negative word, but I don't mean it to be. But it's got that deliberate sense of tweeness about it. And I think it comes from the sort of the girly voice, doesn't it? Stereolab have this too.
Yeah.
It's not like a very soulful, assured voice like Beth Gibbons or or Tracy Thorn singing with Massive Attack. It's a very kind of like understated, underachieving voice in a sense. That's got that kind of sweet schoolgirl quality to it.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how I feel about it. It's always kind of what put me off a little bit of the acts you talked about, St. Etienne's and things like that. I think I preferred a voice that would try and do a little bit more than that. But I definitely like it. Musically, it's fascinating. You can hear the references back to things like the BBC Radiophonic Workshop and library music and stuff like that, which I'm also, very interested in.
Well, I think, what's interesting about it, I guess, is it's got that kind of, as you say, that kind of BBC 50s test card quality, that kind of almost schoolgirl English voice from the 1960s. It's very pure, early Marianne Faithfull even, but it's not quite as sung as early Marianne Faithfull. But as I was saying, the Jane and Barton, it reminds me of specifically.
In a sense, then, are they perhaps they're also signifiers of the fact we're at the beginning of the great era of YouTube, in the sense that it's very easy now to start looking back.
But it's also looking forward, because some of the electronics are quite contemporary and do befit the idea that they're on Warp. So what I kind of think, there's a kind of sort of retro-futurism.
Well, that's what I mean, but it's the beginning of that, in a sense that the past is so easily available that perhaps bands I'm assuming they were in their early 20s at the time. Bands from 10, 20 years before would have just not been aware of that stuff. You know, how would you have heard old library records from the 70s or BBC Radio 5, apart from watching an old episode of Doctor Who or something? You wouldn't have been exposed to that. And yet now in 2024, now we're talking, there are whole generations of musicians and bands that all that stuff is easily available to them through YouTube. But the whole history of music is so easily available that I think nostalgia and the past has become perhaps too much an element of the music that is around, that is available to. Certainly in we've talked about this before, how rock music has not reinvented itself as successfully perhaps as electronic and urban music has managed to reinvent itself. And part of that, I think, is the obsession with the past, the fact that the Led Zeppelin back catalogue is easily available. The Black Sabbath, the entire catalogue of all of these bands can be listened to and absorbed in the space of a couple of hours. Whereas you and I spent years saving our pocket money, going to the record stores and gradually collecting the Rush back catalogue or collecting the Black Sabbath back catalogue or the you know, whatever, the Neil Young back catalogue. Now it's all instantly available, isn't it? And does that kind of mean that music becomes necessarily more regressive and retrospective and more nostalgic?
I think in some genres, yes.
And on that bombshell, we'll move on.
But anyway, I think it's a good, the broadcast album, it's good. And you can see, along with Stereolab, how they influenced a certain kind of aesthetic, visually as well as musically.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's move on to the category mainstream. We've already talked about this record a little bit at the beginning when we were talking about Radiohead. U2, All That You Can't Leave Behind. This is a band, as we said earlier, almost doing the opposite of what Radiohead are doing.
Yeah.
They're saying, what did people like about us when we were doing the Joshua Tree and when we were doing, Boy and War and The Unforgettable Fire? Let's do that again. Because we've kind of done this experiment with, what were the previous two albums? Pop and Zooropa.
And Acting Baby.
And Acting Baby. And was there another record? Maybe that's it. Yeah.
I think that was it.
Those are the previous three records, right? So we've kind of done our experimental thing. Maybe we shouldn't do that anymore. Maybe we should go back and do what people liked, which is strangely at a point that Radiohead are going the complete opposite direction, in a sense. Radiohead are doing what U2 did.
Yeah.
Arguably more successfully. They're kind of doing what U2 did when they made Zooropa, aren't they?
I think they are, to a degree, definitely. Although I think with U2 that maybe it's twofold, really. Number one, they always listened to fans and to the time. So they'd have been really aware of the Bends and OK Computer. And possibly, as I've said, everyone wants to be Radiohead at the point Radiohead becomes something different. U2 are no exception to this. And I think number two, it had sort of soured their irony. So when they first became ironic, should we say, on Acting Baby, it was the right move at the right time and it was brilliant for them. And I think they carried that through onto Zooropa, which again, is arguably more ambitious in some ways than Acting Baby, and Pop. And while Zooropa wants more sort of reinforced, I think they're following. It's what we're saying about with Tusk After Rumours. The sales were getting lower and lower. The stage sets might have been getting more ambitious. But by the time of Pop, people were actually slightly bored by their irony. And I think there was also a reaction to that.
Was there also a sense that the people didn't trust their motives for adopting electronic music and trying to be more hip and more urban? I've always slightly distrusted that. I mean, I like U2, don't get me wrong, I like them a lot. But I think when I hear Tom or Johnny Greenwood adopting krautrock or electronica, I completely believe it's because they genuinely love it.
Yeah.
And I think with Bono and folks, I always felt slightly like it was more of a careerist move. And I might be unfair there. I'm sure they were genuinely excited by the possibilities of music.
Well, there's a difference, isn't there? Because I think that with Radiohead, that there's a continuum, although they're very, very different records. Amnesiac and OK Computer have the same level of seriousness. So if you're looking at the artwork and you're looking at the lyrics and you're looking at Tom York's delivery, actually, he's not shifted probably from the first great Radiohead piece to Amnesiac. Everything around it shifted. Whereas you think of U2, whereas they were this very earnest, anthemic band, by the time you're getting to Acting Babies, Europa, Pop, they're trying comedy, they're trying Elvis Vegas outfits.
Oh, okay.
Do you know what I mean?
In the presentation.
They're very well aware in the presentation and the lyrics. But they're undercutting themselves, which I don't mind.
But partly I think that was a reaction to the fact that people always accuse them of being too pompous, which of course people accuse Radiohead of being too, but Radiohead never seem to have cared.
Yeah.
They don't seem to care. But I think U2 maybe took it to heart a little bit. There was also that tendency with U2 we're going to go back to our Americana roots that they never had growing up in a Northern Ireland. Southern Ireland, I beg your pardon.
Schoolboy era number one, massive.
Well, that's a terrible one. Yeah, no, it's because we were just talking about Van Morrison off air a minute ago.
Yeah.
They never had those Americana roots, and it always made me slightly suspicious, of bands that can suddenly find America,
Yeah.
Although Elton John and Bernie Taupin managed to pull it off in a way, but I never completely buy into it, So is there a sense that they kind of succeeded in their goal? Because this album was massive, wasn't it?
This one did. I think after this point, maybe not. But this one is almost like you're exactly right. Yeah. What do people like about us? What we do? It was full of the most anthemic U2 pop songs for, a decade and a bit. And they do pull it off. They're good. They're confident. It's a strong album. Then again, for me, it's too clean. I just, whereas I think there are some rough edges and some duff bits and brilliant bits on Joshua Tree, which keeps it interesting. This is kind of almost like a streamlined, honed to perfection U2 rock album. So it's always been slightly less...
Little bit contrived in that sense.
But, and one of the things I suppose I never quite trusted about U2 compared to some other artists, Bono is clearly very gifted and a brilliant frontman. But whenever you saw an interview with him, it was either, of course, from the very beginning, Scott Walker's the biggest influence. Of course, from the very beginning, Sugar Cube's the biggest influence. Of course, from the very beginning, punk was my influence. Of course, from the very beginning, it was the Strawbs I loved. He always has, for whatever interview, in whatever era, from the very beginning, it was Stravinsky, Strawbs, punk, Björk, associates that was always running through his music.
I think that's what I mean. I never quite trust him. I think there's a lot of posturing and badge wearing with them. I mean, to be fair, they have an incredibly distinctive sound of their own. And when they're just trying to be U2, which is most of the time, to be fair, it's amazing. But also, I find his lyrics are not that... I mean, there's a song on this album called Elevation, and I'm sorry, but when you start doing chorus rhymes like, I wish I could fly high up in the sky... You're going in Orville the Duck territory for me. That's the laziest rhyme in history, fly sky and high, sorry. And it's in the big single off this record, Elevation, fly sky and high. I'm sorry, you've got to do better than that, seriously.